All right. Welcome to Finance 443. We're in week 3, and I hope you all had a very good Thanksgiving break. Obviously, that's pretty disruptive when it comes to classes like these, where we have a lot of things due every week. If you're like me and have different, you know, different family things, that you're trying to accomplish and take care of, and it's the holiday seasons, you're trying to get some shopping done, maybe for Christmas, things like that. It just gets to be a very busy time of the year. Having said all that, everything that was turned in on time has been graded. I'm missing quite a bit of work from last week, as you all can imagine, with the holiday. A handful of you are just missing some posts on the discussion board. Another handful of you are missing the assignment. And hopefully that wasn't due to the assignment itself. It's just a short essay. You just find a fraud case in your state, talk about regulation in general, talk about that fraud case, and you're good to go and get full credit for it. So for those of you who haven't gotten that in, use this week as an opportunity to catch up and get that done. The test was fairly challenging for many of you, it appears, by the scores. There may be a slight curve on that test based on the average score being a little bit lower than normal. Hopefully, the average score wasn't lower due to the fact that we didn't take the time to take notes based on last week's session, because I gave you all the vocabulary that you needed. I gave you all the topics that you needed, and if you did some good study on Investopedia or on the internet before you got to the test, it should have been fairly straightforward. Now, speaking of the test, I am aware of an issue with the formatting on the test, where on the multiple choice problems, or not the multiple choice, but the matching problems, the definitions are getting the ends of them cut off. And I've looked back through to make sure that the definitions, enough of the definition shows up that you should be okay, and that is the case. Now, I know it's frustrating to not see a full definition or not see an example at the end that you know is there, and it's just getting cut off because of the formatting. I'm going to look into having the school improve the formatting going forward, but just know that for last week's test, I verified every single one of them. You can have if you knew the definition to the problem, then you can do the matching, even though part of it was cut off. Usually, it was an addition to the definition or an example for the definition that was being partially cut off, not the actual definition itself. Having said that, like I say, I know that's not convenient. I apologize. It's just how the test was formatted, and I don't know how to reformat those types of problems without having the school do that. So we'll look into that and make sure the school can do that for future courses. But like I say, I've double-checked that you would be able to get the right answer based on the definition part that is present. This week's test, you've got about 20 questions is all. It's a smaller one again. You've got an hour and a half, plenty of time. And we'll spend, as we always do, the last few minutes of this class going over the topics that you'll need to know for that test. As far as this week's assignment has you looking at, let me pull it up here and just, so the discussion board, I'm getting the two mixed up. The discussion board is, of course, a currency question on foreign currency and international investing. And so this week on the discussion board, we'll be talking about currencies. You'll be looking up different types of currencies, like the Russian ruble and the rupee and the shekel and the dinar for Iraq, which are all interesting, very interesting country currencies as far as I'm concerned. As you know, some of the links, haven't gone to exactly where we want them to go. I've checked this week. Most all of them are working, all the ones that I checked. And so, but if you, for whatever reason can't get to what you were hoping to get to, as far as, what it appears to be or the information that you're trying to get to, just search for it. You'll easily be able to find lots of information on currency. And when we talk about currency, of course, we're talking about the money that these countries use. It's always kind of fun. Sometimes when I get in a class like this, I'll have somebody say, well, I thought everybody in the world just used dollars. Just not really thinking through, that each country has its own currency. And that exchange of currency between different countries and business that takes place across, international lines can be a very complicated issue when you're trying to transition back and forth between one currency to another. That is the foreign exchange market. It's a 24/7 market, open 24 hours a day, never closes, always moving, one currency versus another, and a very interesting marketplace where people do speculate as investors, but most of that marketplace is driven by businesses and banks converting currency and hedging with currency because of their international operations. All right, I'm still on the back end of a cold that I had last week, so I apologize, but good news is that's one of the main advantages of these online classes, right? Is the fact that if I'm sick or if you're sick, we're not going to meet in person. You're not going to have the chance to get what I've got. So that's a big advantage of these online courses. Let me just pull back up the test. There are some matching questions on the test, but like I mentioned before, primarily true, false, and multiple choice questions. Taken straight out of the text for the Series 7 examination again. And I'll go over some of the topic areas, but then we'll also give you the topics a little bit later this evening. So that's this week's assignment is to, the discussion board is that currency issue that we just barely talked about, looking at the different currencies. To circle back around, the actual assignment for week 3 is currency related as well. You'll be talking about or discussing within an assignment international investing, the risks associated with international investing, both pros and cons. What do we mean by international investing? Usually it's investing in stocks or businesses in a country other than the one that you're from. Okay, so if you're here in the United States, if you're American and you're investing in a company or a stock in Thailand, that would be international investment. Okay, that would be an international investment. So that's the assignment this week. Once again, a short paper, lots of articles online for you to look up and look through. There's a link to the World Investment Report for 2014. It's like a 250-page file. You can review that. Please don't read it. That's just a suggested resource if you're looking up a particular country, and within that paper, if you'd like to look up your country, it's got some very good information. But I don't want anybody doing reading from cover to cover that PDF that's hundreds of pages long and just too much information. So just know that there's a link on this week's readings and tools, and also with the assignment that's very, very long. You're not expected to read the whole thing, but I would like you to try to glean something from it. Maybe find the topic maybe a topic that applies to the assignment or the paper that you're writing, and go directly to that. All right, so that is this week's assignment, the discussion board. Keep up, of course, with your checkpoints. We talked about early on in the class how it's worth over half a letter grade. So keep on top of that so that you can get all those points that are available within the checkpoints. And then, like I mentioned, first thing tonight, be sure to use this week 3, as an opportunity to get caught up. We had a holiday week last week, and I think it threw some of your patterns and systems off. Don't get discouraged. Don't give up on the class. You've still got plenty of time with 2 weeks left to accomplish everything. Even if to this point you haven't done anything, you'd still, with considerable effort, be able to accomplish everything that needs to be done to pass the class. So no matter where you're at, just start there, and just make sure and map out, though, this week, and plan out effort, making sure that you've got what you need done and getting caught up. All right, so of course we have some slides tonight that we want to talk about and discuss. But before we get to slides that the Series 7 examination has, there are some different topics that I want to discuss in pretty good detail tonight to help you out with this week's test, but also, primarily these are topics that you're going to see generally on the test. So So that's why we want to make sure and have some information for you. So last week's assignment and discussion board helped you to consider and then demonstrate that you had considered regulation. And when it comes to investing, there are a lot of regulations. We talked about last week how the SEC is at the top, right? That's a government agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission, that regulates, that is the top regulator when it comes to investment policy here in the United States. Now, the SEC is a once again an agency of the federal government, has limited resources as far as how big it is, how many employees it has, geographically where it's located, all those things. And so the SEC allows FINRA, okay, FINRA, which is a self-regulatory body or a self-regulatory organization, an SRO, they allow FINRA to act as the basic rule setter for generally accepted investment practices. So we talked about how, like, there's generally accepted accounting principles that a self-regulatory body made up of practicing professionals in the accounting profession. They come up with their minimum expectations and rules and regulations for themselves, kind of a self-governing institution in and of itself. And the same thing is true on the investment side. And that takes a lot of the pressure off the SEC to have FINRA in the trenches, on the ground per se, in order to watch and regulate and basically act as the policeman for the investment industry and for investment advisors. Now, FINRA, once again, is made up of advisors. You know, it's governed by the advisors themselves, and they come up with basic expectations and generally accepted practices for investments, as we mentioned. There are a lot of rules and regulations when it comes to investments. We mentioned a few of them last week, alluded to a few, and then you found some probably in your research. The Acts of 33 and 34, so the SEC Acts of 1933 and 1934, which were a direct result of significant financial ruin as far as investments were concerned back then, coming out of World War I and II. At that point, we're coming into, we're not yet to World War II, but we're coming out of World War I, the Depression era, and a lot of problems with Wall Street and investment companies and investment advisors. It was kind of the Wild West before that, with very few rules and regulations. Then the rules, the Acts of 33 and 34, really laid the framework or groundwork for most of the rules and regulations that exist today. However, there have obviously been a lot more, added to it. That's just the nature of the beast, of the business. We talked about last week how every time there's some kind of crisis or problem or fraud perpetrated, there will be regulations to react and to try to prevent those types of actions in the future. So as you can imagine, people who are greedy and trying to break rules over all these years have created a lot more regulations for the people participating in the business. A prime example is one that you thought about last week a little bit, probably, either Charles Ponzi, who was how we got the name Ponzi schemes, was named after Charles Ponzi. Some of you might have checked him out. Others of you might have just reflected on Bernie Madoff. I asked you not to do the paper on Bernie, but reflected on how significant the Bernie Madoff scandal was, how much fraud he perpetrated, how many billions of dollars he stole basically from people. And of course, post Bernie, there's been more rules and regulations put in place because he was basically operating right underneath one of the main offices of the SEC. So the SEC was well aware of Bernie. They were monitoring Bernie, and they didn't catch, the fraud that he was perpetrating. So there are some new rules and regulations that are just basically an answer to how poorly, the Bernie Madoff situation turned out because of how long it was able to go on. So regulations, like I say, mostly reactions. I think most people would say that some amount of regulation is necessary, and then too much regulation probably stifles growth and creates problems and is too costly. So the answer is somewhere in between, right? We want a good amount to make sure and create some rules and guidelines for an industry that is affecting you and I as individuals, and our money especially. But then on the other side, if we go too far, we can create a disincentive for the business and the industry to improve and to be trusted. And so, because of their inability to grow because of so much regulation. And there are folks right now that can argue both sides, that there's way too much, and then there are folks that can say, no, there should even be more. It's a very topical discussion right now because of a new law that's coming out, that's already been written but is not fully effective yet. It's the DOL ruling, which is the Department of Labor, which up to date has really not been part or involved in investment regulation at all, is stepping in and has created a whole new set of guidelines and rules for the investment industry. And most of it's well intended to help consumers, but it's such a significant, sweeping change that it's creating a lot of cost and anxiety and angst within the investment world, with investment companies right now to try to comply with all the rules that are coming. So that's the most recent regulation that's a significant game changer when it comes to the investment industry. It's the DOL ruling, or new DOL regulations from the Department of Labor, as I mentioned, which hasn't really been a player to date historically, and now all of a sudden is becoming a significant player within the investment world. So there's a little bit of feedback on regulation. You've already kind of looked into that and done some work on it last week, and we talked about it. So let's move on. There are a couple questions on the test about FDIC, and this is the Federal Depository Insurance Company. And basically, the idea of FDIC is post the Great Depression, we had a lot of bank failures. And one of the things I like to talk about when I was in the insurance industry and selling life insurance was that the insurance companies for annuities and life insurance had a reinsurance program that saved a lot of them coming out of the Great Depression. And so if you look back historically and read about what happened to the insurance industry still struggled, of course, during that time period, but didn't have the widespread defaults and closures like the banking industry did coming out of that period. And one of the reasons that they didn't, among others, is because they had this reinsurance program within insurance companies to help each other and bail each other out if one of them were to be a high risk. The banking industry didn't have anything like that. Coming out of the Great Depression, the government created or helped to create what's called the FDIC. FDIC insurance is something that you see on all your bank deposits now. And it used to be $100,000 just some years ago. Now it's $250,000 of coverage. And what it basically says is that banks pay FDIC insurance premiums to participate in FDIC. But if a bank is about to go under or does go under, like many banks did in 2008 and 2009, depositors, you and I as depositors or bank customers, will get up to $250,000 of our deposits back, but we'll get it back from FDIC if the bank fails. So how does that actually happen? Well, so here in Utah County, we had two banks. We had Barnes Bank and Centennial Bank a few years back in 2008, 2009, during the financial crisis. Both shut their doors. And of course, that creates some panicky folks who go to their bank and the bank that they have their money at, and then all of a sudden the doors are locked. Well, on the door of the bank, there's a notice that says, FDIC has taken control of this particular bank. Here are the times that the bank will reopen, and that you're able to come and retrieve or withdraw your funds from the bank up to the FDIC limits, which are at that point $250,000 per person. So let's say you had a bank account, you're a normal person, you have a checking and a savings, and maybe you have a couple $1,000s is all in the bank. Those assets would have been frozen for a few days, which is still frustrating, right, and inconvenient. But even though the bank failed and went out of business, FDIC would have cut you a check for your full, the full amount, because it was well under $250,000. They would have given you a check for that full amount. Interestingly, Bernie Madoff actually had FDIC coverage, what's called SIPC coverage for his clients. And SIPC coverage is a fraud coverage, basically, that says if somebody perpetrates fraud on your account, this SIPC group will cover up to $500,000 of your deposit. Problem is, a lot of Bernie Madoff investors had millions and millions and millions of dollars invested, so 500,000 wasn't a great return. Still a significant, just devastating loss for so many folks who had invested everything, with Bernie. So that's SIPC. That's an investment insurance. FDIC is a bank depository insurance. So we're talking about bank products like savings, checking, money market. Those types of products have FDIC in most cases. But you can double check that and make sure that the bank is participating in FDIC, but most major banks are. It's just too important not to, but they do pay for the right to be an FDIC bank, right? They pay premiums into a pool so that these banks can help protect one another, and so that people trust the deposit institutions have that backing. If they didn't have that backing, I was over at Chase in 2009, and I'll tell you, many people pulled their money out, not even trusting FDIC. If FDIC wouldn't have been there, there would have been a run on the banks. There was enough fear that people would have done what they did back in the Great Depression, and they would have tried to pull everything out. And when everybody tries to do that at once, the banks are not prepared for that, cannot provide for that, and they would have all folded if it weren't for government-related backing, like the FDIC. So far, FDIC has been highly successful since the Great Depression in bailing out basically depositors for banks that go belly up. It's not to say that it's foolproof. There were many people back in 2008 and 2009 that I think correctly stated that if enough large banks would have gone out of business, the FDIC would have been insolvent and wouldn't have been able to do what it was intended to do. So that's where the government had to step in and bail some large ones out, like AIG, and stop Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers from completely going, without selling off their assets. Washington Mutual, Wachovia, some of these banks, Countrywide, they had to come in and kind of help arrange a buyout with some other banks to make sure that those institutions just didn't go completely insolvent, because that would have put too much pressure, I think, on FDIC, and we would have shown, or it would have proved out that the FDIC can't withstand anything. But it's been highly successful in helping small banks, recover deposits for their investors. And I shouldn't say investors, for their depositors, right? Because this is a bank insurance. Welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining. Can you hear me okay? We're just going over a few of the topics that you'll need to know this week, specifically for the test. Then we'll go over some of the slides from Series 7 information. We spent the first few minutes tonight talking about what to expect this week with the discussion board, with the assignment, with the test. Encourage you to get caught up if you need to do that after a Thanksgiving holiday, right? So anyway, you can go back and listen to that. I won't repeat that, but we did talk about, for the last 5 or 10 minutes, we've been talking about regulation, and then we just wrapped up talking about FDIC. Good. So thanks for joining in. I appreciate it. So we need to talk a little bit about economics. This is not an economics class, so we don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but we need to spend a few minutes talking about some basic economic principles, because they will be on the test. And then along those lines, if you were to take an Economics 101 class, you would spend a little bit of time talking about the Fed. And so we need to talk a little bit about the Fed and its role. Very topical conversation based on the election from a week and a half ago, because the Fed is very powerful. This is Janet Yellen. She's the chairman of the Fed. You see her. She's got short hair. She was a professor. You see her on TV a lot if you watch CNBC. And a lot of the articles that happen on CNBC, in the Wall Street Journal, and other places, business journals, will mention Janet Yellen a lot. She's very, very powerful because she runs and is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. And the Fed is a very powerful institution. It's fairly autonomous from the federal government, so it's not It's not a branch of the federal government. It's not an agency of the federal government, but it is um, something that our government sponsors and supports to try to help keep our currency strong, or at least relatively strong, and keep inflation under control. So it's an institution that's there to try to protect us from having rampant inflation. But we'll talk about the Fed here in just a second, what they can do. First, I want to talk about some economic issues that you're going to come across in the test. First of all, one of the things that the test asks a few questions about is a topic that it's going to ask a few questions about is business cycles, understanding business cycles. And of course, you have cycles all the time in business. You have expansionary cycles, you have contractionary cycles, you have peaking and troughing. So you have tops and bottoms, and then you have these periods of expansion and contraction. Of course, when we talk about the economy, we talk about times of contraction, we're talking about recessionary periods. Talk about periods of expansion, we're talking about, periods where the market's growing, right? And usually we're measuring economic cycles by GDP, right? Gross domestic product, which basically the productivity growth of the country. If that GDP number is shrinking, is a negative number, we're in a recessionary period. If that GDP number is growing, even if it's growing slow like it has over the past, 8-9 years, that's still positive, expansion when it comes to our economy. So you have these cycles. Economy goes through cycles, as you well know, and then there are also business cycles, right? So businesses can go through their own cycles as well, where they have periods of significant growth, and then they can have periods where it gets slower, and then you can go through periods where it goes the other direction. Now, an example of this is a company like Walmart. For decades, Walmart was a high growth, just very fast moving growth company. Then it got to a point over the last 4 or 5 years where it was a lot harder to grow, right? It's already so big. It's such a huge company. Very difficult for a company like that to grow very fast. And in fact, over the last year or two, people have worried that, Walmart's starting to close stores. Maybe they grew too fast. Maybe they're going to contract some. It's not about Walmart making money. They still make great money, right? They have phenomenal cash flow, phenomenal sales. But overall, their trajectory has slowed down considerably over the past 5 to 10 years relative to what it used to be, right? And so good business, bad business, that's not what it's about. Most all businesses go through these cycles of high growth periods, and they go through cycles where they might contract some as they change or as they try to pivot to something different, as far as what they're doing. That's perfectly normal for companies. But it's very important to know where we're at in the economic cycle when you're looking to invest, right? So if we're just about to go into a recession, and the recession is going to be prolonged, like the recession of 2000, 2001, and 2002, not a great time to be a new investor, okay, at the beginning of that cycle. Now, if we get 2 or 3 years into that cycle, and then you're an investor, then you're investing at what could be a very good opportunity, right? So knowing where the economic cycle is can help us to understand how we should invest at different times, and how aggressive we should be, or how conservative we should be at different times. One other quick thing about economics that we need to talk about in investing is lagging indicators, leading indicators, and what that means. So you've got lagging indicators, and that just means that you've got things that happen in the economy, numbers that we get from our economic numbers, that just show what the economy was doing before. That's a lagging indicator. A great example of a lagging indicator is unemployment. Unemployment historically has always been a lagging indicator, meaning you can have very good unemployment numbers and be in the midst of a recession, and it just reflects that you were in a very good economic situation before the recession, right? So it lags. Then, for years after 2008, the recession of 2008, we had pretty poor unemployment numbers, right? Especially in 09, 10, 11, those 3 years were really bad unemployment numbers. That was a lagging indicator showing us just how bad 2008 was. but it's not a leading indicator. Doesn't necessarily tell us very well what's going on currently or what will happen in the future. That's why we refer to it as a lagging indicator. And there's lots of different economic indicators, lagging, leading, and current, that tell us different things, but it's important to know what that information, how that information should be used, right? If Chris, if I told you that unemployment was really, really good right now, you might say, oh, that must mean the economy's doing well and I should invest money. No, actually that just means that the economy has been doing well over the past few years, right? Doesn't mean that it's going to be really good going forward, because like we say, unemployment's a lagging indicator. Now let's talk a little bit about leading indicators. Leading indicators include things like durable goods purchasing or durable goods sales, those numbers. Basically, we're talking about goods that are bought and sold by manufacturing firms. If they're increasing their purchasing of durable goods, that usually is a very positive leading indicator going forward that the economy is in good shape. Another leading indicator is housing starts. These are people, getting a permit to construct a home, and that's usually a good leading indicator. That will mean usually that that things are going to be good if there's a lot of housing starts going forward. And there are a lot of other indicators, both leading, lagging, and then current, like I mentioned. But it's important to understand when we see a headline, okay, that catches our attention, and the news agencies, of course, all they're looking for is good headlines. And so a lot of times they'll throw a headline out about unemployment or about housing starts or something like that, and people will interpret that all of those things indicate what's happening now in the economy, and that would be incorrect, right? Because a lot of those are either leading or lagging indicators, which means that they don't have anything to do with what's going on in the economy right now. They're showing us something that either is going to happen in the future or has already happened in the past, like is the case with unemployment. All right. So that's what I wanted to talk about with economics. Any questions, Chris, on that? Lagging indicators, leading indicators, or business cycles, investment cycles, economic cycles, anything like that didn't make sense as I talked through it? So if you've got any questions, let me know. I want to move on to the Fed and just talk a little bit about the Fed. So what is the Fed? The Fed is a group of, well, they're called Fed governors, but basically it's a relatively small group of very powerful folks that determine interest rate policy in this country. What do I mean by interest rate policy? They determine the rate that the banks will get on borrowing money from the government. And that rate will determine what you and I get as a rate when we borrow money from a bank. So if banks are paying higher rates to the federal government for overnight funds, then you and I as consumers will pay higher rates on our mortgages, cars, everything that we borrow for. The flip side is we'll get paid a little bit more on our deposits. So right now, Chris, rates are at all-time lows. Normalized interest rates from the Fed usually range between 3 and 4%. Right now, the overnight rate from the Fed funds rate, is a quarter point, 0.25%. And that's actually up. We increased that rate last year, Janet Yellen did, and the Federal Reserve did this last year, from 0. Okay? So interest rates are at all-time lows on mortgages, all-time lows on car loans. And the reason for that is that for an extended period of time, the Federal Reserve has had very low interest rates that they've charged to banks. And in turn, banks have charged us low interest rates on our lending, or on our borrowing, on their lending. So what does that all mean? What that means is that right now we're at very artificially low interest rates. If you look at history of interest rates, in fact, there was an article that I was looking at earlier today that graphically showed 100 plus years of interest rate history, and the average interest rate was more like 4 to 5%. Right now, at near 0, we're way off of that, right? So at some point, interest rates will have to go back up. At some point, borrowing rates for both homes and cars and student loans will all go back up, much to our chagrin, right, if we're still in the mode of borrowing. But if you are in a situation where you're borrowing right now and then you're saving in the future, you want rates to do that, right? You want to lock in low rates now as you're borrowing. And then when you get older and have more to save, you want rates to be higher. Current retirees are in the exact opposite situation. They spent 30 years paying down debt, getting ready for retirement, saving as much as they could, and now that they're retired, interest rates are at all-time lows. They get paid almost nothing on CDs, savings accounts, money markets, all these different instruments that they expected to get paid pretty well on. So it's a two-edged sword, right? The folks that are borrowing money right now are very, very happy with how low rates are. But the folks who are saving money right now or are trying to get money on their deposits are very frustrated with how low rates are. Now, why does the Fed raise or lower interest rates? The Fed has two main objectives with lowering and raising interest rates. Historically, their main objective was to make sure that we don't experience significant inflation. Why do we worry about inflation? Well, there's always going to be some inflation. The Fed is concerned with significant inflation because that devalues our currency, that devalues our dollar, and makes it very hard for you and I to have an improved life over time. So one of the things that happens in third world countries is that they have hyperinflation or inflation because they don't have a powerful Fed like we do to offset inflation. And they turn into a situation where their currency goes to near zero or goes to near worthless. And that creates poverty, widespread poverty, because people can't, from one day to the next, their dollars become very, very, their values of their money go down significantly from one day to the next. That's where you get into a situation like in Africa or South America where there'll be a picture of somebody taking a wheelbarrow full of cash to a convenience store to buy a loaf of bread. That's hyperinflation, right? Which is something that the Fed is there to try to prevent from happening. How do they prevent it? When the economy starts to grow and gets growing, their job is to raise interest rates and actually not stop the growth, but just slow the growth so that we don't get into a hyperinflation situation. The flip side is true though too. So when we go into a recession like 2008 and everything's falling apart and business is frozen and nobody's spending any money, the flip side is they can lower interest rates to artificially help stimulate the economy because they don't want deflation either. Deflation can be just devastating. Japan's been dealing with some deflationary pressures, and it's been devastating for their economy. So you don't want the economy to stagnate, but you also don't want the economy to get too hot. So think of the Fed as kind of a regulator, right? It's there to kind of regulate that the economy doesn't get too hot, but it also doesn't get too cold. Wants to keep us in a nice, warm, in-between zone where we're growing. We're not growing too fast, but we're also not retracting and going down. So what does the Fed do? The Fed raises interest rates to slow the economy when they feel like the economy needs to be slowed down. And when the economy is really in bad shape, they lower interest rates like they did after 2008 to stimulate the economy, to put more money into banks so the banks will lend more money to investors and to business owners so they can grow their businesses and grow the economy. Okay? So rates are at all-time lows. Now the Fed has the job now to make sure, after having rates low for so long, to raise interest rates back to normal levels, but do it without rocking the apple cart now, right? Economy's been doing okay. If they raise rates too fast, most people would say that might put us back into recession. So they have to be very careful about how they do that. All right, that's what I wanted to discuss on these different topics. Let's look at a few more pages, and then let's get to what you need to know beyond what I just mentioned specifically for the test. So one of the areas that you learn about for the Series 7 examination is different products. Okay, so products like bonds, stocks, ETFs, which are exchange-traded funds, mutual funds, derivatives like options, margin, those types of things. So one of the things that the if we had a textbook this week, it would cover is fixed income, which another name for fixed income is debt, which another name for debt is bonds. Those are all synonymous, okay? They all mean the same thing. Fixed income, debt, and bonds, all the same thing. And what they mean, what they are, is debt of a company, okay, that investors have purchased because they got the promise from that company that they would pay them back with interest over time, okay? And I said companies, but companies, municipalities like cities, states, and counties, and then also our federal government all issue bonds, okay? When the government issues bonds, they're called treasuries. So you've got treasury notes, you've got treasury bonds, okay, like savings bonds. And so these are different instruments that the federal government issues with a promise that they'll pay us back the full amount with interest, over time. So the federal government, when we talk about the federal government having $16 trillion in debt, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the government has issued paper, basically, notes to people saying, I will pay you back with interest over time, and there's $16 trillion of that debt issued to both individuals here in the United States, businesses, companies, but also foreign countries. And one of the issues that raises a lot of eyebrows is the fact that countries like China, who don't necessarily have our best interest at heart, are one of our biggest creditors, meaning one of the biggest places that we owe money to, okay? And that gives them power. Having debt that we owe, that we've promised to pay back with interest to other countries, gives those other countries some leverage over us in different ways, depending on how much we owe them, okay? Just like somebody who you have a credit card with, if you owe them a lot of money through that credit card, they then have some power and leverage over you, right? Same thing is true for our country. And one of the issues that we deal with when we talk about government debt, okay? There are all kinds of different bonds. The one I mentioned early is the companies. So Walmart, again, using Walmart as an example, let's say they want to build 200 new stores in China, but they don't want to use all their cash to do that because each one of their stores costs a lot of money, costs millions of dollars to build. So instead of using all their cash or borrowing from a bank, they issue bonds, and investors buy those bonds, and then Walmart promises to pay them back with interest over time. How does Walmart pay them back with interest over time? Well, they use the revenues from those new locations, right? So that's how they get the money to pay us back as investors. I think that's all I actually want to cover as far as the slides. Let me just look a bit more. Oh, I mentioned you've also got municipals. So we've got treasuries, which are federal government bonds. Then you've got corporate bonds, like from different companies, like Microsoft issues bonds and Walmart issues bonds. Those companies issue bonds to help fund their growth. And then you have municipal bonds. And there's something very unique about municipal bonds. I mentioned that the other two bonds are paying you back interest over time plus your money back, right? The same is true for municipals. The advantage or unique thing about municipals is that when a county or city or state borrow money and they promise to pay us back over time with interest, just like other bonds, in their case, there's a special rule or consideration for them that allows the interest that they pay out to you or I to be tax-free. So when you have U.S. Treasury bonds or when you have corporate bonds, that income comes and it's taxable, right? It's taxable dividends. But when municipalities pay us interest or pay us our dividend payments or interest payments over time, those are tax-free. So that's a significant advantage for cities, counties, and states when they borrow money, because they can effectively borrow money at a much lower rate. And the reason they can borrow money at a lower rate is because you and I as investors will take a lower rate because we get it tax-free. So if I can get 5% tax-free from a municipality, or I could get 5% taxable from the federal government, I'm going to take the 5% tax-free, right? Because that's a better benefit to me. I'm even going to take less. I'd take 4.5, or I'd take even 4 if my tax rate is high enough, because in the end, after taxes, I'm getting a better return from municipalities. So what that does is it allows municipalities to issue debt and make promises to pay lower interest because you and I are getting it tax-free. Okay? So that's something pretty unique and interesting about municipal debt. When the city of Provo that I live in issues debt, so that they can build out some infrastructure or build a new facility of some kind when they bond. We just had an election. There were probably issues of bonding on that election ballot for you if you voted. Those bonds, when our city or county or state pay back interest on those bonds, they pay it to you and I, and we don't have to pay taxes on that interest. Great advantage for municipal bond holders and for municipalities in general that they can do that. Section talks about variable annuities and real estate investment contracts. Not very interested in talking about either one of those, the specifics of which we talk about in other classes that I've taught. Everybody always wants to talk about options and derivatives because of the late night programs that say you can get rich by trading options or Forex trading. Not interested in anybody doing that unless they do a lot of homework. I'll leave it at derivative products always have significant risk. They just do. Ironically, the reason derivative products exist is because they were meant to be hedging strategies for people and businesses to hedge other risks that they have. But now people speculate with derivatives, and it can be a great opportunity if it's done right, and if you really know what you're doing. You can take on good risks and have odds in your favor to make good money off of them. And then you have people who are just speculating because somebody made some money somewhere and they just want to be able to do that, get rich quick type approach. And that one usually ends with you not making any money and sometimes ends with you losing a lot of money. So just be careful with derivatives. Not as easy as it looks, not as simple as it looks, but still can be a very good strategy to add to other things that you're doing, especially if it's used how it's intended to be used, derivatives, as a hedge, okay? As something that mitigates the risk that you have with other investments that you are investing in. Okay. And then we've got retirement issues. One of the things for the Series 7 exams, you got to understand the basics of retirement and tax. Basics of like 401k plans, IRAs, and then different tax considerations like estate taxes and gift taxes and income taxes. And just make sure you have a basic understanding of those so that when you're giving advice to somebody, you take all those things into consideration and not just give them advice without knowing, whether or not those things are impacting that individual or not. Okay. All right. So went pretty fast through those different slides, spent most of our time on the main topics, which was by design. We wanted to make sure those are clear and that you feel good about those. Let me give you some ideas or give you some notes for the test this week. Chris, if you don't mind sharing, did you feel okay about the test last week? I know you were in the session, but did you get the topics down and get some good studying in and then feel okay about the test last week? I mentioned early on in the class tonight that a lot of people struggled with the test last week. It was a pretty tough exam as far as the average score. But I'm kind of curious if people, put in a lot of time studying and really took their time with the test and then took notes from last week's session on all the topics. Yeah. Did you know as soon as you were doing the test that things were not going right, Chris? Huh. The reason I ask is because a lot of the questions obviously were those matching questions. And I mentioned early on, that it cut off some of those definitions, and I know that made it challenging. Although I've checked all of them and made sure that I could still get the right answer based on having most of the definition. And I apologize that the formatting, didn't work for us very well on that. The school set up the test, and the formatting's pretty bad. Yeah, they were. And that kind of goes to, to understanding the difference between understanding really what something is versus just having a definition in front of you, right? It is pretty different. And maybe that's something I should have emphasized a little better last week is make sure you understand what these concepts are. Don't just have the definition written down because it won't match, right? The point of the test is to try to get beyond just regurgitating information, but actually having us understand. And so that probably confused a lot of people more than just you, Chris. So, all right, well, that's good feedback. This week we've got some more matching problems, and so keep in mind that I'll give you what you need to know as far as the information, but maybe digging in a little further than just finding the definition would be good. Make sure you understand kind of the concept more than just memorizing a definition or having it written down in front of you. All right, number 1 on the test, we want to know the test wants to know what the purposes of the Securities and Exchange Acts of 1933 and 1934 are. So this is back to our regulation discussion. We kind of started with that tonight. So make sure you understand the basic reason why the Securities Act of 33 and 34, and make sure you read the question carefully, okay, for number 1. Not that it's going to be tricky, but I just, this is one of these ones that's so easy and so straightforward, I worry that sometimes we second guess it or don't read it right. That's the only reason we'll get it wrong. Yeah, and like I say, Chris, I think most of the class is in your same boat where they didn't feel very good about that test. I may curve it still. I'm still kind of considering it. There were 3 or 4 folks who got really good scores. So I hesitate to curve and have them, benefit, when they already did really well. But where the bulk of the class struggled on it, that's something we'll look at, we'll consider. All right, so number 1 on the test, the Securities and Exchange Acts of 33 and 34. What's the basic purpose of those? Then number 2, we've got some matching problems. You'll want to be able to understand the basic differences between the Act of 34, the Act of 40, okay, and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. Okay, so if you know those 3, you'll be in good shape. Act of 1934, Investment Company Act of 1940, and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, which are basically post-WorldCom and Enron. Then number 3, FDIC. Okay, FDIC. Keep in mind for FDIC, as we talked about it, that there's $250,000 worth of coverage, and it is per depositor and it is per bank, but it only covers banks, right? Doesn't cover credit unions, doesn't cover savings and loans, doesn't cover thrifts, just banks. So keep that in mind for number 3 on the test, or it'll trip you up. FDIC is only for banks. Number 4 on the test, just make sure you understand that FDIC is only for deposit accounts like checking and savings. Number 5 on the test is kind of a tricky question. Basically, it asks, if you have some investments and you're getting paid interest on them, and then that interest goes into your checking account or savings account, is that interest FDIC insured? And the answer is, well, if it's in the checking or savings account, yes. If it's still in the investment account, no, right? If it's reinvested back into the investment, then no. If it's taken out and put into the bank account at a checking or savings account, then it would be FDIC covered. And this goes back to FDIC coverage covers bank deposits. It does not cover stocks, bonds, mutual funds, anything like that. So I work at a bank, for example, and when clients come in and they do investments with me, I have to have them actually initial that they understand that they're not buying a bank product and they don't have FDIC on the investments that I set up for people. And the reason is we don't want anybody confused about whether or not they have FDIC or not. FDIC is only on deposits, checking, savings, money market, CDs, those types of instruments. It is not on stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, investments. What we'd consider normally to be investments do not have FDIC. What we consider to normally be deposits does have FDIC if it's a bank. okay, if it's a bank. Number 6 on the test, we talked about business cycles. Just make sure you understand the phases of a business cycle. What are the phases of a business cycle? Make sure you understand what a depression and a recession are as part of a cycle. Okay. We talked about how recessions and depressions are caused by the contraction part of the cycle, right? When we have GDC, or gross domestic product, that is negative, okay, so we're contracting, that either indicates that we're in a recessionary period, or if it's extreme enough, even could be a depression period. Number 8 on the test asks whether or not business cycles are cyclical and repetitive. Know before you get to number 8 on the test whether or not business cycles are repetitive or not. Do they repeat? Do they cycle? Either yes or no, right? Make sure you understand that. Make sure you understand leading indicators. We talked about leading indicators. Okay. Talked about different types of leading indicators. We talked about you'll want to know the difference between GDP and GNP. GDP is domestic product, gross domestic product, so just here in the US. Gross national product is anybody who's a citizen of the US, no matter where they live in the world. So a little bit different measurements. GDP is the one that we use more regularly for, measuring how the economy is doing. Make sure you understand what the actual unemployment rate, how we measure the unemployment rate. So what is the unemployment rate? It sounds really straightforward, but actually understand before you get to the test how we measure the unemployment rate. Number 9, I'm going to give you this one because we talked about unemployment rate as a lagging indicator. Okay, we talked about unemployment as a lagging indicator, and that's going to throw you for number 9. Number 9, the answer is true. Okay, it's talking about leading indicators, and it adds unemployment, even though traditionally unemployment is not a leading indicator. It's a lagging indicator. So number 9 is true. Okay, then we got to skip back up here. 11 was that unemployment definition. Make sure you understand how we measure unemployment. Number 12, CPI. This is an inflation measure. Make sure you understand how we measure CPI. Number 13 on the test is matching. You need to know leading, coincident indicators, and lagging indicators. Coincident meaning current indicators, leading indicators, and lagging indicators. Just the basic difference between the definition of those 3, and you'll get those 3 right on question 13. Question 14, make sure you understand what the Keynesian theory is. Keynesian. Basically, what is that theory? Okay, monetarist theory, which is different than the Keynesian theory. Basically, what is that theory? And you'll get number 15 right. Number 16 is another monetarist theory question. Again, don't need to know all the ins and outs of the monetarist theory, but know the basics and you'll get 16 right. 17, same thing, monetarist theory. 18, understand where money comes from. Okay, does it come from printing press at the Federal Reserve? Does it come from the government? Where does it come from? Okay. Number 19, we talked about the Fed, how they control interest rates. They also print money. That's where our actual currency comes from. Okay. They're authorized to create new currency through the Treasury. Number 20, we talked about the main objectives of the Fed, right? We talked about how they change interest rates in order to limit a hot economy or limit a cold economy, right? And try to moderate or regulate, how fast an economy is improving or how bad an economy is at any given point, okay? To either stimulate or contract a cycle in order to stay on top of inflation and to stay on top of unemployment as well, which is another key motivator as far as what they're doing. Decisions they make usually has to do with inflation or unemployment. Okay, so that's number 20 on the test. Okay, so you've got a lot about economics, a little bit about the Fed, FDIC, and regulation. That's why we made sure and covered those topics at the beginning of class today, talked about them pretty extensively, but there's a little bit of new material as far as some topics on the test that you'll need to go and look up. Make sure you feel comfortable with those before you get on the test. And once again, a little more than a definition. Make sure you kind of understand the concept, right? And then when the definition is a little different than what you expect, you'll still be okay. Chris, anything else you need from me before we wrap up tonight? If not, have a great evening. Have a good week. Let me know if there's anything we can do for you. If you get stuck on anything, zip me a quick email. And just another reminder to the whole class to get caught up the best you can this week. Use it as an opportunity to get on track so that we can finish strong with our last week next week. And congrats on making it halfway. All right, Chris, have a great night. Have a good week, and we'll talk to you later.